and welcome to From the Periphery podcast. I'm Karena Avedissian. In this episode, we explore how Armenian Genocide studies is grappling or failing to grapple with the ongoing genocide in Gaza. This episode builds conceptually on episode 194 of The Fire These Times, where Elia Ayub spoke with historian Amos Goldberg in an episode titled Holocaust Studies and the Gaza Genocide. I'll post a link to that in our show notes. Our guest today is Elyse Semerdjian, social historian of the Ottoman Empire at Clark University in the U.S. Elyse's research focuses on the experiences of Ottoman Armenian women during and after the 1915 Armenian Genocide. Elyse has spoken out about the field's silence on Israel's actions in Gaza. This conversation comes amid increasing restrictions on free speech at U.S. universities, particularly around criticism of Israel, creating a chilling effect in academia. Fields like Armenian studies, often tied to Holocaust studies, face added pressures from funding dependencies and institutional influences tethered to pro-Israel and Zionist influences. So to start, Elyse shared a troubling incident in a pre-interview chat. So there was a vote on a resolution to publicly condemn the genocide in Gaza, which initially seemed poised to pass and then didn't. Could you walk us through what happened? What was the group? If you don't want to name what it is exactly, that's fine. And kind of how this reflects the fear and the pressure that scholars face right now.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Karena. So it was actually almost exactly 1 year ago that it was mostly myself and Rachel Goshgarian, who's at Lafayette College, drafted a resolution, and we took it to the board of the Society for Armenian Studies of that association. I'm still in that association. I'm the vice president. Then it went through some redrafting through committee, and then this is typical, and then it went up for a vote. And at first, it looked like the resolution might pass, and then suddenly it didn't. The last week of voting, the tide changed, and it puzzled us because we didn't know if, was there something we didn't know about the membership? So we did a survey of the membership. The survey's never been analyzed. The data, it was dropped. But the question was, maybe there are some different opinions. We should know our membership, who our membership is, and then the whole situation was dropped. I thought about now that, you have articles, front page of the New York Times about famine and even op-eds about the question of genocide in Gaza in the New York Times. I thought, well, maybe I would try to bring it back through the association. But I talked to a few people, and I feel like the association has spoken. Some of the issues that arose, this always happens. The first issue academics typically raise is we are not a political association. And that is a huge question because I'm also a member of Middle East Studies Association. And so when the BDS vote was being discussed some years ago, and this was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the discussions were we're not a political association. And so a lot of academics were raising that concern. The counter arguments were, when we have issues like scholasticide, when we have, Rafat al-Arir, one of our colleagues, being murdered, a scholar of Shakespeare and a teacher and professor of literature in Gaza, we have a moral obligation to be involved, to say something when schools or universities are attacked or university professors are murdered. In this case, they were already looking at other offensives on Gaza where schools and educational infrastructure was destroyed. And also our other argument that the advocates for BDS were making was the tying together of universities with the military. We can find that here too. We can find that in almost any setting, but there were a number of different examples they brought to the floor. It was a long process in Middle East studies. That vote did not happen immediately. First, they changed the bylaws to loosen them so that they could say we can speak out on these matters. They took out a word, and I believe it was non-political was the word that they took out of the bylaws. And then it was several years later, maybe 4 or 5 years later, that the vote happened. The vote happened online, and it might have been during COVID. So it took a while, and they prepared the way and had created a lot of fora around the question before the vote. Now, with regard to Syrian study or Armenian studies, I think we have complicated viewpoints. First of all, we have, Armenians who are from the MENA region. We have Armenians who are also from Jerusalem, from the West Bank, and they're in our midst as well. And people from the MENA region are, very acutely aware. Some of them have survived bombardments, so they're very acutely aware of the situation. Also diaspora and Armenians who have different attitudes. So diaspora is plural. We have different viewpoints. And I think that for Armenia right now, looking at also its shift towards the West, its policies will have to be very amenable to Israel. So maybe some people are swayed by that. Others are looking at the weapons that were used by Azerbaijan against Armenians during the Second Karabakh War and, the Israeli kamikaze drones and others that were used against Armenian soldiers. So, I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised at the outcome of the vote.
Yeah, I wanted to zoom out a bit and talk. I mean, you already kind of started touching on the topic of Armenian studies as a field. Just for our listeners, Armenian Genocide Studies investigates 1915 to 1923. I mean, the years are, you can argue them. Ottoman Genocide, its legacies, which continue to shape memory, geopolitics today in Armenia, law. The field also engages with the legal and ethical legacies of genocide. Turkish state denialism of Armenian genocide has impacted the field significantly. And in many different ways, Turkey's direct pressure on researchers through legal, professional, personal threats, through Turkish money in academia, efforts to discredit genocide scholars through limiting access to primary sources, right? Because Ottoman archives in Turkey are often restricted, which forces many scholars in Armenian genocide studies to rely more on survivor testimonies and secondary sources from non-Turkish archives, but then, denialists then dismiss those as biased or incomplete. But I wanted to also underline the fact that Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide in 1944, drew directly on the Armenian case when developing the concept that now underpins international law on crimes against humanity, and that continues to inform the study of other genocides. So I wanted to ask, given that Armenian Genocide Studies has long grappled with state-sponsored denialism, institutional pressures around that, and the ethical imperatives of bearing witness, how does Gaza echo these historical challenges and highlight the field's role in addressing contemporary genocide?
Well, it's interesting because the way you're narrating it, the idea that there's a kind of an ethical impulse in this field, in some spaces you would be very hard pressed to find it. Now, all of a sudden, there's this idea of, treating it like it's a discipline like classics, where we just, read text and do classwork and analysis of text. But I've been told repeatedly over the last nearly 2 years that we're an academic field, we're not political. I guess my question is, are we a pro-genocide field or are we an anti-genocide field? And I think by choosing to be in the area of anti-genocide or genocide prevention, we're automatically a political field. So I think this idea that somehow politics is separate from, maybe there's some really deep politics to like your analysis of Homer's Odyssey or something, but our field is built out of like a kind of an ethical imperative, as you've pointed out. So, and that imperative's been around for a very long time. To me, what's remarkable is how you have Armenians trying to document, very similar to Palestinians in Gaza, documenting their own genocide in real time, writing down testimony, recording testimony. There's a group of people who published Agony of a People, which is 1916 text generated by Zabel Yesayan. She sat down with a survivor and composed his testimony for him. She did that in 1916, very early, and it just got translated and published. And so I would just say we're very interested in this because people were doing this for activists. It wasn't like Zabel went out to interview this survivor, as an academic exercise or a literary exercise, although she was able to use her talents to help someone not only express what he went through, but also what the people he came in contact with went through who were deceased. So even the deceased get to speak beyond the grave. Holocaust studies, it's a very robust field. It's so much larger than Armenian genocide studies. We are kind of the junior sister with much less resources. But, I think it would be almost ludicrous to ask whether or not people in Holocaust studies, to ask them to not have a political viewpoint, on the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But we've come to this point where we've been conditioned to think that having politics is somehow a greater evil than actually killing people.
Yeah. This apoliticization or the resistance to politicize what, is probably already political inherently. Is this a new thing to reject the politicization, quote unquote, of genocide studies, of treating it as like the classics, like you said?
Well, I think people were just unaware that, at least in the United States, there is a kind of default politics to some of these fields. Can you imagine Armenian studies that's actually, anti-Armenian? I think it's embedded in the structure of how these positions are funded, how they're tied to these giant hedge funds that we call universities. These are corporate entities. They get nonprofit status, but they are corporate entities that are always looking at bottom lines and profit margins. And so if funding is taken away from a center because, let's say, not that I plan on doing this, like somehow just bashing on Armenians in public, one could imagine the funding for my position would be taken away if I were doing things that were outside of the mission of the donation. And so, I think that's definitely at stake for people who are now like where the default position, of course, is to support, Jewish people, to support the Jewish nation. And then all of a sudden there's a policy that you're like, oh my God, I cannot abide by that. And so we have huge numbers of scholars who've taken personal risk. Some of them have had their endowed chairs removed by name, not the money, but the name. We have a network of, it's called the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network. And I think it's approaching 800 members now.
It emerged in response to Gaza?
In response to Gaza.
Okay.
And leading the way are genocide scholars. Leading the way are Holocaust scholars, actually, who created the network. One of the major figures is Michael Rothberg. They penned a letter that was published in The Guardian last month and announcing their association and their large membership. And, they cannot abide by what they see because they're Holocaust scholars. They understand what they're seeing. Another person of that order would be Omer Bartov at Brown University. He's done a lot of public speaking and has spoken out and had the op-ed in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago saying, this is genocide. I'm a scholar. I can identify a genocide because the pattern for anyone who's studied Lemkin is crystal clear. The pattern is there. In fact, the starvation pattern is a very silent killer. I wrote a piece about that called Genocide by Attrition, comparing it to Artsakh. But the starvation pattern, which we also saw in Sueda recently, it's what Lemkin called racial discrimination in feeding. And so if you've studied the works, I think there is, whether it's institutional or also personal feelings, like I think some people just are having a kind of cognitive dissonance or just cannot believe what they see. It must be fake. It must be AI generated. The mediatized images are not helping either because people can see like one of the most horrific things and not believe it.
I'm reminded actually of this, idea, I think, that's been written about a bit, but I've noticed more in kind of Armenian conversations amongst one another, where there's this realization that so much of what underpinned, efforts at recognizing the Armenian genocide was based on awareness raising, like this taken for granted assumption that, if only people knew what was happening, they would stop it. And Gaza and Palestine just as a whole has just completely blown up that idea. And it's just requiring completely new ways of thinking about it and thinking about how to, fight back, resist, bring awareness to, honor the memory of, et cetera, all the things that we, want to do around genocide.
I guess I would say people always knew. People knew. Tal Brutman, who produced a book about it's called the Auschwitz album. It's a very famous kind of album of compilation of photographs from Auschwitz. In his presentation, there's an image of a Jew being lynched. And what he does is he zooms in on different areas of the photograph. It's a brilliant study. And you see at least like 8 cameras being held by audience members. So one of the questions he raises, what about all those other photographs that might be in people's private collections at home? The grandparents or uncles or whatever collected these photos as souvenir photos of a lynching of a Jew. He just has one snapshot from the Auschwitz album. But guess what I would say is that there were always a proliferation of witnesses and cameras. And so this whole thing about if only people knew, I mean, I have seen images that I've never seen anything like them before. I mean, it's almost like with each moving day, I'm seeing more horrific images. And so there's no lack of information. But then again, in his book, Exterminate the Brutes, Sven Lidquist was one of our scholars of genocide studies who writes mostly about colonization in Africa and genocide. He says it's never been a lack of evidence. That's never been the issue. There's always been evidence. We just have a different kind. It's not a hand-snipped photograph.
You briefly mentioned the relationship between Armenian genocide studies and Holocaust studies as being the kind of little sister. Could you describe that relationship in a little more detail, like institutionally, structurally? There's like informal networks as well, I'm sure, of scholars.
Yeah, I mean, my intellectual heroes are in Holocaust and Jewish studies. Like I've long admired all of these scholars who I get to read and then be inspired to maybe reframe or rework some of our concepts in Armenian genocide studies or Armenian studies. So, I mean, a lot of the institutions that we have, I mean, like, for example, a very important one is the Holocaust Museum in the United States here in Washington, D.C., because students who don't work on the Holocaust are seeking funding because we are a comparative center. So where do they get funding if they're not working on the Holocaust? That's the huge question. And it's not only a question for students. I mean, if there is a scholar, I know you have your own research project too, like there's a scholar who wants to work on something, I'm always directing them to just mainstream institutions because I know there's no, that I know of, major granting agency that would give you a year or 6 months to work on a project. The funding is much more small and piecemeal. So Armenian funding, Holocaust Museum and a number of other agencies that have also fellowships and have, grants for students and internships. And so we have some things, but nothing on that scale. And it makes it so, we're always scrambling for funding to fund the research, the actual research. My understanding is I think our community, the Armenian community, loves brick and mortar projects. Like they love to build buildings. But like the idea of, okay, there's somebody's going to write this really innovative book on Armenian genocide studies. How do we give that person a 12-month leave from work, pay them so they sit and write the book for a year? That kind of question doesn't seem to be at the forefront of our communities. Now, there's also this question of Holocaust and genocide studies. There's a scholar, his name is Ümit Ungür, he's Turkish, wrote an amazing book, The Making of Modern Turkey, that talks about, the Armenian genocide, but also has some very important documents from the Ottoman archives about the beginnings of attacks on Kurds, if we want to call it like this long kind of ethnic cleansing or genocidal process against the Kurds. He's worked on Syria as well. He calls the field Holocaust and genocide studies. He calls it cucumber and vegetable studies.
Why?
Well, they're all vegetables, right? It's kind of a funny little thing he made up, but he used it in one of his essays in our forum on Gaza. And he raised some really important questions. He was basically saying, why do we call it Holocaust and genocide studies when they're all vegetables, right? It's vegetable studies. I don't know. It's just interesting. We have to name the cucumber. And,
is it like a cute way of being a bit dismissive about it?
Maybe. I think he's a true comparativist in the sense that he has worked on the Armenian genocide. In that work, he's already comparing with Kurds. He's also worked on Syria. He has some important work on genocidal activities of the Assad regime.
Hmm.
So I think he wants all of these fields just to be in conversation, but we do often distinguish, and a lot of the Holocaust and genocide centers, they are very much Holocaust forward. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying it's the nature of, how donations are working, which also circumscribe the work and the mission. It's areas where I would love to see someone fully fund an endowed chair in Yazidi genocide studies. Why is that? That somehow seems unimaginable. I don't know. We have underrepresentation of Africa and Asia.
It's interesting. I mean, so again, structurally, in terms of like finances, influence, institutionalizedness, Holocaust studies is, ahead of the others. What are the others, besides Armenian studies, which is one of the little siblings?
Well, we have a center emerging at University of Toronto. I mean, there is a center for Ukrainian studies, but Ukrainian studying genocidal patterns in Ukraine. Abduction of children, forcible assimilation, refusal to acknowledge the existence of Ukrainian identity, that sort of thing, mass rape and gender violence. So, I mean, Ukraine is one. One of my colleagues works on the Herero Nama genocide in East Africa, which is very important. And there's still a lot of really tender political dynamics with Germany over this, including repatriation of remains. I think that's a genocide that really should be studied in depth if we want to understand the Armenian Genocide. We want to understand the Holocaust because it's an important precursor. In general, like colonial genocides in Africa are just not given that much attention. I mean, I'm thankful I had a colleague for some years who worked on that, but now she's moved on to another university.
Rwanda as well, probably.
Rwanda, we do have, one of my PhD students is working on Rwanda. So we do have a lot of student interest in Rwanda. We have student interest also in Nigeria, in the Biafra. And so, I would like to see more people working on, I have a student working on the question of genocide in Syria. That field is emerging. I would say also there is a Palestinian genocide field emerging. And I don't know if people want to acknowledge it. They can not acknowledge it, but I think it's happening.
Yeah.
And we also had people who were already doing that kind of work before October 7th. There's a lot of people also analyzing the rhetorical frames between Palestinians and Israelis, the rhetoric of we're fighting Nazis in Gaza, as Amos Goldberg pointed out, as a kind of move away from the exceptionalism of the Holocaust and kind of using the Holocaust imagery to frame the Palestinians. But that also has been going on for a long time before October 7th. I would like to see more work on Yazidis. I will tell you, as having a student who's working on this, we have memoirs and we have travel narratives or people who've encountered journalists. And there are some people already working on applying the genocide principles and concepts to the case of the Kurds in Turkey. So there's a couple of works. They haven't come out yet, but I think that's going to also be a really important emerging. We generally need more scholars to engage genocide studies who are doing also Middle East studies.
To connect with the broader field, or?
Yeah, to connect with different fields. Like, let's say somebody wants to start thinking about sectarian violence in Lebanon. I mean, it would be really interesting for them to be in conversation with the genocide field. I'm very interested in what my students doing with Syria, and we've been reading some very new, very fresh scholarship mostly by Syrians writing about the Syrian war and genocidal practices there. Now, whether it's a legal case, that's the other question, because the Armenian genocide studies in particular, there are some scholars, and I don't dismiss their work, but they were obsessed with building dossiers to prove criminality, criminal intent, to build legal cases against the state of Turkey. I mean, maybe one of the most important for that would be Hakan Dadrian, who's a sociologist, who building dossiers. There's others still doing that kind of work. And so there's always been that kind of impulse for some people in the field that makes it even more narrow. Like the work we're doing is very politicized, but in this narrow way of trying to build a case for The Hague, build a case for an international criminal case.
I've noticed that the more recent studies, including yours as well, focus on the social and the kind of personal experiences of genocide that are actually, extremely instructive and informative on different levels. I think in many ways, I'm not a genocide scholar, I'm a social movement scholar, and I, still have, being of Armenian descent and having, ancestors who were genocide survivors. So much of the experience of, the legacy of genocide was a question to me in terms of, was this an event that kind of happened and then ended? And it's just like understanding the ongoing effects of it on, family, on society, on, geopolitics. There's so many levels of that. I remember hearing about peers who, years ago, who were wanting to become international lawyers to take Turkey to international court, one of the courts to, for genocide. And I thought that was so cool. The US then recognized the genocide. When was it? A couple years ago. And it was, so anticlimactic and was like, okay, whatever. And, for decades, so much of Armenian American activity was focused on that, on getting the U.S. to recognize it. And then it happened, and it was like, so what?
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's a very singular agenda. I'm not here to bash anyone who says, like, wakes up in the morning and says, this is my duty in life, is to prove that the Armenian Genocide happened, which I think, again, no lack of evidence there, but prove that it happened, and then work towards, some kind of justice that would, be some kind of legal justice. But I don't believe that law always produces justice. I would say one of the things about scholarship is that, I'm able to do my work on the backs of people like Richard Hovhannisyan, Vahakan Dadrian. These are people who were building the kind of documentary case, evidentiary case about the Armenian Genocide. So there was never a lack of evidence. Just going back to Sven Ledquist, there's evidence galore. But I would say Vahakan Dadrian was very interested in the Turkish archive. He was very interested in what he could extract from the Ottoman State Archive, the Başbakanlık in Istanbul. And that's a great archive, right? But I've also sat in that archive and not received my documents. I'm not saying I'm banned. I can walk in. But when I ask for 16th century documents, I get them. 17th century documents, I get them. And then in the past, 19th century documents, 20th. So I don't physically go in there. I don't physically go in there. That doesn't mean I'm not getting work done there. But I don't physically go there anymore. And the Ottoman documents are also, abducted Armenian women aren't even named by name. And for me, that's strange as somebody who works in Ottoman documentation, mostly on Syria. Everyone gets a name when they come to court, but all of a sudden the woman plaintiff doesn't get a name. There's so much violence in these documents. I never understood the fetishism. I had the fetishism, but I had to drop it because I realized, mostly by reading outside of my field, like how violent these documents are, that they're not giving the full story. So I guess what I would say is that because of the empirical work they did, I now can say, why don't we turn to something else? Why don't we turn to something in Arabic or Armenian or an accidental archive that was never supposed to be an archive? Or there's now a movement to go into people's personal or private papers and archives, and some really cool work is being done with that, even if it's fragmentary. These are documents that don't have the same kind of state-controlled taint that the Ottoman documents. Now, people will be very upset with this because there are people whose entire careers are hitched to the wagon of Ottoman documents. But what I was trying to say out loud is, as a feminist, I can't hitch my wagon there. I'll use it. Of course, I'm turning back to another project where I'm going back to some earlier histories, and I need to use Ottoman documents. I'm never going to look at them like there's some kind of font of knowledge. That somehow we were in the perpetrator archive, which is what I call it, and I've extracted the silver bullet that proves definitively that there was intent to commit the Armenian Genocide. That's just not my project. I would rather write about women's lives, women's experiences, and also, to be honest with you, document the disappearance of some of these Armenian communities, including the very low population of Armenians in Aleppo today, which is my next project. So,
I mean, we were just talking about that. I was just thinking about the power dynamics involved in that. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine who has been working on displaced archives. She's of Armenian background in Canada. And she was telling me in her sort of small network, informal network of scholars who work on displaced archives, the Armenians, very small, about their relationship to Ottoman archives and kind of how they look at the relationship with the what did you call it, perpetrator archives?
I mean, some people take objection to that, but yeah, I consider the
Yeah.
Ottoman state archives perpetrator archives.
And she was talking about some colleagues that they're in contact with, Palestinian scholars who work on displaced archives. And what she was describing, I think she was referring to, maybe just a small circle of scholars that work on projects that they're involved in. So I don't think this necessarily describes the whole field. But she was saying there was this interesting interaction between the Palestinian scholars and the Armenian scholars, where the Palestinian scholars were dead set against going to Israel to access archives about them in the obvious sense, right? Like, going there to the perpetrator state would be kind of, almost like justifying the need for Israel being there to hold these archives in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Armenians had this kind of attempt at a conversation to almost convey that it was almost like, we don't know how to tell you this, but it feels like we are where you're going to be in 50 years, where we got over that in the sense that now, if we can get our hands on any archives, we'll just be so grateful and happy because we've lost so much that we're happy just to have that, which was this interesting and really uncomfortable interaction between two groups of scholars undergoing or going through similar historical processes.
Again, like I'm thankful, especially I know that we have today, it's a lot. I mean, there was Bahak and Dadrin, but now we have all these Turkish scholars, very highly skilled, using these archives, writing these histories. And I'm just like, more power to you. This is fantastic. Keep doing what you're doing. But I do think that we could be just a little more reflective about what we're engaged in when we're using that archive. That's all I'm asking for.
Yeah.
And then what I am asking for is for people to consider just the riches that we have in Armenian. Oh, there's just absolute riches. And I am a latecomer to using Armenian sources. But like, for example, I've just been reading some Hushamadian, and they're fantastic,
Yeah.
These Hushamadian, I won't go through the background. They were headed to the garbage. We were able to get them. And I was working on Armenian women's lamentations for a feminist project. And oh my gosh, the riches. So it was one of the students at our center just could grab them and told me, you're looking for some stuff. You're going to find it here. We now are in a position, I would say those early historians, especially Dadrian, was not using survivor testimony. I think that kind of taint also has lifted in the sense that now we're much more comfortable using survivor testimony, and students are using it in creative ways, pairing them with sources to sort of validate what survivors were saying. And in a lot of that all those great sources, a lot of them are in Armenian. So I think I've enjoyed seeing that also Ottoman studies is moving towards using Western Armenian. So many young scholars, even Turkish scholars, are studying Turkish and Kurdish scholars are studying Western Armenian because they want to read the sources, because Armenians produce so much. Yeah. So whatever you think you're going to find in the Ottoman archive, you're going to find volumes in Western Armenian. And so it's just an invitation and trying to kind of balance different sources together.
Yeah. I wanted to shift gears a bit and talk about the sort of, the academic environment right now in the US. We've seen restrictions being put on free speech on campuses in the US, combined with federal actions targeting critics of Israel, and all of this kind of fostering what you called in our pre-recording conversation the preemptive abidance to authoritarianism, where scholars are now kind of self-censoring on Gaza out of fear for their jobs. How have you seen that develop, and what's happening now?
Well, we still have universities open, which is nice. We just have to start there. And then, I mean, I think the capitulation was totally predictable. I don't really consider our universities as they've evolved to be as educational as they are financial institutions now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't take much to make an institution into a puppet if it's all about purse strings. And so cutting off of federal aid, cutting off of visas, a case-by-case deal basis, these are all kind of interesting things that I've seen already functioning in universities. The neoliberal arts, we could call it, the neoliberal universities. I've seen this so much over the last, especially 15 years, where a kind of a full-on embrace of autocratic, authoritarian tendencies has already been present in the universities because presidents really are kind of like kings. They get these king's salaries and king's coffers. And so I've seen that like in different institutions over the years, unilateral rule, announcements are made, no deliberation, no collective decision making. So democracy was already, like the democratic cultures of universities was already compromised. So I'm not at all surprised that it's been very easy to control the most powerful institutions like Harvard, Columbia. I would just say that there was already kind of a groundwork laid that made the system vulnerable. So whether it's gender and sexuality studies, whether queer studies and race and ethnic studies, and then also controls on, since the topic of this is Gaza, the passage of the IHRA or IRA definition of anti-Semitism on some campuses means that you really can't teach anything that might be construed as critical of Israel and its policies. And let me tell you, because we are very obsessed with countries like Azerbaijan, Turkey, other bad actors would love to have rules like this where saying anything critical of the state of Turkey is Islamophobic. Therefore, you can't. I can imagine that already happening. So I think we open up a window. And so once we've given up academic freedom and critical thinking, I really think we've formalized these institutions as hedge funds. And I'm using that term hedge fund because that's what Rashid Khalidi is called Columbia. It's just a hedge fund. I think they're all hedge funds of a sort. And I think that we're looking at trouble if these types of definitions pass. I personally, it's very subjective what is critical. And then I would just say at Columbia, because recently both Rashid Khalidi and Marianne Hirsch published opinions in The Guardian. Rashid had a class of 300 that he was going to teach this fall, Middle East history. He's not going to teach it because he said he can't teach it in this environment where they passed this IRA definition. Marianne Hirsch, who is a wonderful scholar of post-memory, she also said, I don't know if I can teach at Columbia if I can't teach Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt was also very critical of Zionism. So being critical of Zionism is also misconstrued as anti-Semitism when there's a long Jewish tradition of debating and critiquing Zionism. And Hannah Arendt being one of our most important scholars, especially for these times to be reading her, it's just very devastating to think that it might be against school policy to teach somebody like her.
I wanted to talk about the ethical and intellectual consequences of these sort of norms being established. Given these pressures, I mean, you're basically completely transforming the intellectual foundations of genocide studies in the sense, not maybe like institutionally, but the intellectual pursuit of study, of inquiry, of genocide, not in the classical, studying the classics, like you were saying. And, there's been some essays written by scholars of genocide studies who've been saying that this is basically the end of genocide studies, at least as we know it. Do you share that view?
Oh, I don't know if it's the end. I'm somebody who looks at the past, and I'm not sure about the future. Yeah, there were some essays I published right after October 7th. One was in Al Jazeera. His name is Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi, published Gaza and the Dilemmas of Genocide Scholars. He was basically saying that the field itself is acting against genocide prevention. I think the whole academy is evolving, and first of all, I do not believe that most of our institutions will be open in a few years. I think many universities are going to close in the US because we already know that the federal funding is being weaponized, and it will be much more effective on poorer institutions. The other ones that stay afloat will comply. So maybe genocide studies will get up a field like white genocide studies, right? All you need is like a Koch brother to fund that shit and it will happen. And, maybe I'm being glib here, but I think that money talks, and people can use in an oligarchy, people can use their wealth in different, very powerful ways. And so if you're going to do things like close down the Museum of African American History, or, shut down parts of the Smithsonian and have them, you just sort of dictate the party line. I mean, we know that there are people in this ruling party who believe the fact of immigration from the global south is in itself a white genocide. I do think that some universities may close because this government is ready to defund if you don't comply. And that will affect genocide studies. What I've noticed with other kinds of austerity is that we had like a huge, when I first started being a professor more than 24 years ago, there was a huge boon to hire people in different areas to cover the global south, to cover Africa, to cover the Middle East. But what happens with austerity is there's always a privileging of American history and European history. So I think over time, those areas will be preserved at the expense of the others. And by that, I mean the others, like the vegetables, like they're just going to be out there. So I'm saying this and I'm doing this. I want to acknowledge that I never thought that I would hold this position, and my position is an endowed chair. So I am in a different position, but the closure of universities and the closure of academic freedom affect me just as much as everybody else, because I don't know what the use of an endowed chair is if there's no university attached to it. So saving American universities, of course, is something I believe in.
I'm getting to the last question here, which is kind of maybe a big question, but you were talking a bit about post-memory. These are the ways in which trauma memory are passed to subsequent generations, and the kind of constraining of what can be said and not said and studied in universities around genocide, whether it's Gaza or Armenian genocide or other genocides, is impacted, right, moving forward in terms of those post-memory dynamics and the opportunities you have to understand different aspects of those that you would have normally been able to have, really kind of free intellectual inquiries into to understand them. And then you had also mentioned the broader implications of this serving as a model for other authoritarian, autocratic states like Turkey, like Azerbaijan, like lots of other countries that would see what Israel's doing with the discourse around anti-Semitism and the formalization of sanctioning what is deemed, to be anti-Semitic. And then you mentioned a few scholars, Rashi Khalidi, Marianne Hirsch, and I wanted to ask what ideas are circulating right now, what conversations are being had in terms of resistance, in terms of alternative storytelling that could perhaps be, at least temporarily for now, until, everyone figures it out, a way to keep the study of genocide going.
Boy.
In terms of educating, continuing telling these stories.
Wow. One of the things that I'm interested in, and some others, there's outreach, getting into the schools, talking to teachers, getting into communities. I think that's one way to do it. And there are people with far more money and vaster resources than we are who can do it. They've already formed different associations that will go and teach you these things from a particular viewpoint. But I mean, the idea that scholars doing it could actually offer maybe a little more balance and not be tied to a particular state's point of view. We did a lot of that post 9/11. I'd like to see more of that. I'd also like to see, I don't know how to even begin it, but when I heard that Rashid Khalidi was just going to take his class online and teach it for free, I think that a lot more of us need to be doing that kind of work. We used to call them teach-ins during periods of political crisis where we would all sit together for a day or two and just learn from each other. And so I think that's one way. You're calling it alternative storytelling, but I would just say alternative education. or free and ongoing education. I know that there are places like some colleges and universities that are now offering degrees for free, especially here in Massachusetts, where there's great programming for education. I mean, I think there's ways to kind of reach people and make it at like no cost to them, just to kind of nurture curiosity. I mean, one of the things about these universities today, I think the more they become corporatized, the more that students are also looking at them a place where they kind of go through these certain motions and get a degree. But nurturing curiosity, which I try to do, it's very hard. It's hard to nurture curiosity. We're fighting the daily shocks of political life. We're fighting people's kind of ongoing residual emotional effects from COVID. We're fighting and trying to get students to be truly curious and separated from their phone and more interfaced with humans in long term could produce a better world. So for genocide scholars, I don't know if other genocide scholars are thinking this way, but I have appreciated Scholars for Peace. It's these videos that a number of Jewish studies and Holocaust scholars have made over the last almost 2 years. They're very informative. They're using TikTok and other things to get these messages out. I think we could use tech, but we could also use low-tech ways to kind of bring people together and offer what we're offering at a very high price at no cost to more people.
Yeah.
That was maybe a very long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. Would you like to plug your book for our audience?
Yeah, my book, Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide. It's I've called it a kind of feminist reading of the Armenian Genocide, but it really does look very closely at embodiment, the body, as a kind of a target of genocide. And my premise is basically that genocide is a manifestation of extreme patriarchy and that we could never really understand it fully unless we examine how the perpetrator understands gender and sexuality and weaponizes it to unravel communities. Yeah, I invite you to read it. It's a difficult read, but if you can, it's also, originally I wanted it to be a scrapbook, and I couldn't get that to pass with my press, so we had to reframe it, restructure it. But you can read different parts of it. And the third part of the book is actually about bones and Armenian memory practices in and around Deir Zor. And I got to talk to Armenians who went there, who created their own memory practices in a place that's not very well marked, and also talk about some Arab deities, Arab descendants of Armenians who are also carrying forth the memory of the Armenian Genocide.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
From the Periphery is a worker-owned media collective. We focus on elevating voices, struggles, and ideas that are peripheralized and marginalized under mainstream journalism and academia. If you like the work we do and want to see more of it, please consider heading over to patreon.com and become a member today. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, and to join the community that's been growing around our work. If you can't support financially, there are still a number of ways you can support us. You can leave a 5-star rating on the podcast app you're using to listen, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're listening, all of which helps us against the algorithm. Most importantly, tell your friends and family about us to help spread the word. Thank you so much for listening.